Okay, welcome back. So hope everybody had a good weekend. Nice weather weekend. And so just a reminder that I've already got quite a few of your midterms, but the midterm two is due today. So make sure you send me an email, get that in sometime before midnight tonight, or I guess but end of the day today. So not due until the end of the day, but make sure you get your midterm two submitted today. And that's again due by email. I've already got most of yours, or quite a few. And then also, if you wanted to do the extra credit, that was also due today. So that was here. So here's your midterm, which most of you have already done, and then the extra credit. So those are both due by email. Most importantly, the midterm. But there we go. Okay. So we're moving on. So we're essentially 2/3 of the way done. I think we only have 5 more meetings, if I'm not mistaken. What's today? The 19th, right? Yeah. So 5 more meetings, it looks like, and we won't be meeting during finals week because you have a take-home final. So we've got 5 more meetings, and so yeah, we've done 10. I got 5 more, so 1/3 of the way to go, and then we're done with the class. Okay, so we're moving on. Like I said in the email, like I've been referencing, we're going to be doing all macroeconomics from here on out. So today we'll do chapters 10, 11. So I want to do 2 chapters, but these are both kind of intro to macro. We're going to cover some key big macro variables like GDP and inflation, things you're probably very familiar with and hear a lot in the news. So this will probably be some. I think you'll like, um, just by reaction and the amount of people that did the homework. I would guess that probably chapter 16 was our least favorite so far. So I think you'll like this a lot better. Um, uh, nothing, no big crazy trade models anymore. So we got lots of macro stuff. We'll do kind of an intro to macro today. We'll do fiscal policy next week, and then we'll do some money and banking, and finish up with monetary policy. And so all of this stuff, hopefully you get some idea and some more knowledge of what all the stuff that's being thrown around in the news and podcasts and whatever. And so I think most of the macroeconomic stuff very relevant. And you'll probably when you hear some key words or key terms, you'll be like, oh, well, now I can talk about that. So I'll try to keep I'll try to talk about current events as they relate to the chapters. If you have any questions as we go along that relate to current events or current ideas you have or heard on the news or any podcast or anything like that, then please ask them, and I'll try to see if I can answer them uh, as we go along. So let's go ahead and start on macroeconomics. And so chapter 10 is going to talk about the number one or the most popular macroeconomic variable, which is GDP. And then chapter 11, we'll talk about some more things like inflation and unemployment, stuff like that. Okay, so let's start with chapter 10. Okay, and so again, if you do have your textbook, these will probably be kind of fun chapters to read because I think they're a little less technical than the previous few chapters and probably more familiar with current events, stuff like that. So if you do have the textbook and are doing the readings, I'd recommend reading um, some of the macro chapters starting with chapter 10, if that's an option for you. Okay, so go ahead and go to study guides and go ahead and open up the chapter 10 with notes and solution. We'll start with that. And then go ahead and go to PowerPoint and go ahead and open up. I don't know why, I'm not sure why they did reverse order, but the chapter 10 one is the last one here. So chapter 10 PowerPoint. All right, so we'll start with chapter 10. Assuming we have time, we'll do chapter 11 as well, and then I have a homework that combines both chapters. So we'll get to that later. So this week's homework is a combination of chapters 10 and 11, so just one homework assignment. And they're much shorter questions, but one assignment for both the chapters. Okay, so chapter 10. All right, so first thing you want to start with macroeconomics, besides just what it is let's start talking about the number one thing you talk about in macroeconomics, which is GDP. Okay, so very first thing we need to talk about and discuss is something you're probably familiar with called gross domestic product. Okay, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how to measure it and how that can be changed, adjusted for inflation, how that can illustrate growth and stuff like that. So this chapter is really all about GDP. But first, let's go ahead and define what GDP is. Okay, so you've probably heard this term before, this acronym. Let's go ahead and formally define it on slides 2 through 4. Okay, so gross domestic product, or GDP, is a measure of aggregate output. So it's a measure of how, it's supposed to be a good measure of how productive an economy is during a certain period of time. It's a pretty good measure. It's not perfect, but this is one of our best measures of how productive the economy is, meaning that if the economy is doing better, if we're booming, we're going to be producing more stuff, and we can measure that with more output. If we're in a recession or if the world shuts down, like it did last March, we're going to have less GDP, less output because we have constraints. So it's not a perfect measure, but it's a pretty good measure of at least how well the economy is doing at the current time or has done for a certain period of time. It is a monetary measure, which means that we're putting everything in terms of, for the US dollars. Okay, and there's some important things to note. First is what this is supposed to measure. It's the market value in dollars of all final goods and services, and that means that we're not going to count intermediate goods, or goods that we're not going to count used goods, and we'll talk more on that. But it's only new goods produced within that year because, um, so first of all, intermediate goods means like the goods that go into the production process. So if we're measuring um, a new home, a new house, which we're going to talk about a lot today because that's a key hot topic. If we're looking at a new home, that would be counted in GDP. But if we're looking at the goods that go into producing the home, like lumber, which price has gone up a lot recently, glass, things that go into the home, we don't count the intermediate goods or the inputs. We only count the final goods. So if we're counting something like a new car or a new house, we essentially only count the final market value of that good or service. We don't count the goods that go into it, and we also don't count used goods. Okay, and the reason why we don't count used goods is because those were counted in some other previous year. So if we're looking at um, the value of new goods produced in 2021, okay, it's only the new goods. If we're looking at a used house that was sold or something like that, or a used car, that was counted in whatever year that car or house was built, in that year's GDP. Okay, so we want to try to avoid double counting, and so we're not going to include intermediate goods or inputs, and we're not going to include used goods. All right. This is a nice simple example of why we're doing it in terms of um, dollar values and not just things. And so if you're trying to see what GDP was, and let's say there was only 2 years to simplify in two goods, and those two goods were sofas and computers. So you can produce more, you might produce more sofas and more computers in 1 year and the next. And so if 1 year you produce, the economy produced three sofas and two computers, the next year they produce two sofas and three computers. Okay, we don't know what that means. So you have to put those things in terms of their dollar value and see what that accounts to. Okay, so if sofas are valued at $500 and computers are valued at 2,000, okay, then you gotta count up the value of all those sofas and the value of all those computers in the first year, which would come out to 5,500, and then do the same in the next year. So if you put them in terms of dollar value, you can see that this bundle of goods is worth more than this bundle of goods. So just in this very simple example, in dollar terms, GDP is higher in the second year because you got to put the dollar value on the things, and that way you know what these things are worth. So if you can't put a dollar value on it, things like black market goods and underground opportunities, if you can't put a dollar value on it, you can't put it on GDP because you got to be able to estimate the value added. Okay, so another thing of importance is when measuring GDP, we're not including any financial transactions, and so like public transfer payments, would so that would be like well, a good example of that would be like the stimulus checks. So the stimulus checks don't count as the only thing we're doing is moving money around. Now, if the stimulus checks lead to more customers buying more things and that leads to more production, that would count as more production and more GDP. But just the implicit transfer of money from the federal government to your bank account, that's not adding anything. It's only when people buy things and more things get produced that we add to GDP. So any transfer of money doesn't count, public or private, all right? So that includes stock market and bond transactions because you're really not buying anything, all right? So if you buy a stock or a bond, you're just trading an asset for cash or for a payment. Okay, nothing's being produced. Now, if the company becomes more productive and that leads to more things being produced down the road, we would count that. But the specific sale of stocks and bonds or any financial asset doesn't count as GDP because nothing's being produced. You're just essentially transferring money from one person who uh, sells the asset and the other person who gets the asset. Okay, nothing's being produced, but specifically by selling a stock or a bond. Okay, and also very important, no secondhand sales. Like I said, no used goods. So if we're looking at the value of new goods and services being produced, that's a new good. That doesn't count used cars. That doesn't count used house. That doesn't count houses that were already built. That doesn't count textbook sales. That doesn't count um, used video games. Things like things that were already new some other period of time went into that year's GDP. So if it's a secondhand sale, if it's being sold by the second or third time, not included because nothing new is being produced. Okay, so hopefully that is a good starting point of what GDP is. And so I know you've heard of GDP. I know you're familiar with gross domestic product, but hopefully that makes a little more sense. So we're going to talk a lot more about it, but just kind of pointing out some of the caveats of what it includes and what it doesn't include is a good way to start. And the second thing we're going to do is look at a nice simple nice simple metric to measure GDP. All right, and so we're going to look at measuring GDP by this approach called the expenditures approach, and it's going to kind of categorize things in four different categories, and we're going to put them in the categories, and we'll sum it up, and that'll give us a nice measure of GDP in some specific year. So let's look at how we're going to measure GDP and how other people measure GDP in slides 5 through 8. Okay, and again, if you have any questions on any of this stuff, please, or how this relates to current events, then please ask, and I'll try to answer those. Um, Measuring GDP. Okay, uh, we're going to look at the approach, the most popular approach called the expenditures approach, and what we're going to do is count the sum of money spent buying the final goods. So we're trying to count up how much. So there's I guess two ways you can possibly measure GDP. The first would be how much is just estimate the value, and probably the easier approach is to estimate how much was spent on those goods and services. Because if you look at how much was spent, then that puts a value on those services. So if nothing was purchased or value, then it's hard to put a value on it. But this is a nice way of seeing how all these different categories spent on new goods and services, and you kind of sum them all up, and that's going to be the way we're going to measure GDP to see how much total was spent on new goods and services. And if we estimate that, that's our measure of GDP. Okay, so the goal here is to count the sum of money in US dollars spent buying final goods and services for some specific period of time. So we could be looking at uh, 2001 GDP, we can be looking at 2020 GDP, we could be looking at quarter one GDP, stuff like that. So you have to, normally it's either a yearly thing or a quarterly thing, okay? So this equation on the study guide that we're building up to, this one here, okay, GDP equals C plus I subscript G plus G plus Xn, all right? So we're gonna define all these categories. And so essentially there's four separate expenditure categories. We're going to define those categories. And then once you can try to figure out how much each of these categories spent in total, then your total GDP is just adding them all up together. Okay, so we're going to first define the C. Okay, so C is called officially personal consumption expenditure. So this is what individuals and households spent. So if you count up all the durable goods, which I believe or something that lasts 3 years or longer, right? Was that the? I think that was the category from like chapter one or chapter two. So I think durable goods last 3 years or longer. Uh, non-durable goods last 3 years or less, and then we have services, which are any services like uh, restaurant meals, haircuts, medical service, lawyer fees, things like that. So any service goes in the service category. So we got to put the category. It's going to go if it's consumer spending. It's either they're spending on a durable good, a non-durable good, or a service. Okay, so if it's a new good or service, it's got to go in one of those categories. Okay, and so this is going to include domestic plus foreign goods produced because, um, well, it's only it includes the goods if they're produced in the U.S. So we'll come back to this term, but if any good is, let's see, uh, purchased by internationally and it's produced in the US, it counts in the specific category. And we'll get to that for imports. But just think of this as what consumers or households spend on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services for a specific period of time for new goods and services, and add all those together, and that's our total C. That's our total personal consumption expenditure. Uh, this is like consumption spending. So if you buy groceries, that goes into here. If you buy a new car, that goes into here. If you get a haircut, it goes into here. If you go hire a lawyer, that goes into here. So any of those things that are new good or service like that go into this category. Okay. Next category is this one. I, oops, I subscript G, which essentially stands for gross private domestic investment. Okay, so it's a fancy term, but this really, the majority of this is just private business spending. So IG, or gross private domestic investment, is pretty much all spending by private firms and private companies. So any machinery, any equipment, any tools, any construction, any computers, anything that kind of goes into the capital category would be spending in domestic investments. So any amount of money that a firm or a private business spends on a new good or service would go into this category. Okay, and this means also new assets. So if there's new inventory created in the warehouse or new computers produced, that would also count. So you got to, if you can value all the new assets that the firms produce or spend money on, then that's in this category. Now this also includes um, the purchase of a new. This includes homes. So buying a new home doesn't go into this category. You might think it should, but it's considered an investment, and because it's considered an investment, it goes into this category. So if anyone buys a new home, it goes into this category. Now, a new a used home doesn't count because nothing new is being produced. Um, but if you like if you add a new section, if you make improvements to the home, right? So that's essentially a new capital asset or like a increase in the value of some of the parts of the house that would count. And so if it's the creation of something new that's valued at a or it could be if something gets if it's valued less. So if it's a change if it's a change in just the price of a new home, it doesn't go in here. But if it's the purchase of a new home, it goes in here. Or if there's some improvement to it, it would also go in here. Okay, so new homes don't go here. New homes go here. Used homes don't go anywhere. But if there's a improvement to a home, that goes into here. If you could put a value on that. Okay. So any new homes or any home improvement projects, I mean, official, not just like painting your bedroom, or if there's an improvement that shows value in the market, like a new, like you add a garage or you add a second story or something like that, or you add a swimming pool. Okay, so if you add something new, that goes here. Okay, so this is consumption spending by households and individuals. This is private business spending, also includes houses. The last two, G and X subscript N. Okay, G is government purchases. So this is public spending. All right. So this is essentially everything we counted here, but now it's in the public sector. So if the government or the public sector spends money on goods and services, uh, durable goods, non-durable goods, or buys anything, that goes into this category. Okay. And again, we don't include transfer payments, so this would not include any of the stimulus checks or anything like that. Any unemployment. Okay, that only counts if it leads to the production of new goods and services. So we've got consumption spending, private business spending, and public spending. And there's one more thing, XN, which is net exports. And so this one's a little bit tricky, but it should make sense once you think through it, this is exported goods minus imports. Okay, and the reason we're doing it this way is because the a measure of GDP counts the value of new goods and services produced within a certain period of time in that country's borders. So if we're looking at the US, this is the GDP in the US. Now, if we produce something in the US and someone internationally buys it as an export, that still counts because we produced it. Now, if we buy, iPhones from another country, that goes into their GDP. So we only count the stuff in the US GDP that's produced in the US. Anything that's imported goes into that other country's GDP, and we take it out of our estimate. Okay, so should make sense once you figure that we're just trying to count the production of goods and services in the US or whatever country you're looking at, and imports shouldn't count because those are produced in some other country or wherever they were produced. Okay, that adds to whatever country that was, that goes into their GDP. They produced it, we just bought it. Okay. Um, so then if we understand the categories, then those are essentially all the, so if we're counting money spent on a new good or service in the US during some specific period of time, it's either got to go into consumption, gross private investment, government spending, or net exports. And so the terms are fancier than you can think of them. So this is just consumption spending. This is just business spending. This is public spending, and this is spending by international money. That's really all it is. So if you're counting a new good or service, it's got to go in one of these categories, right? There's nowhere else it can go. So it's got to go in one of these categories. And then if you can add up all those categories, the spending in all those categories, that's your estimate of GDP for that specific period of time. Okay. Um, Everyone good so far? Any questions on what, well, we'll do some more examples on here, but any questions on what GDP is, kind of the spending categories? I think we get a good idea. So it's really not that complicated. You just have to pay attention to detail and to what gets included and what doesn't. So it's more of an accounting thing than a lot of math or anything like that. Okay. All right. Next thing is, so we're gonna use this equation quite a few times, especially or including today's examples and homework. So make sure you're familiar with those categories. Let's talk about nominal GDP versus real GDP. Okay, this is important. Slides 10 through 11. Okay, so if we're comparing GDP over certain periods of time, we got to control for something that's very important, which is inflation. All right, so you might hear in the news that inflation isn't important or inflation never happens, but inflation does happen, and it happened. I'll show you kind of the historical trend, but prices do increase over time, and you have to control for that to compare GDP, which is in a specific year's dollars. So if GDP is a dollar measure, if you're looking at like uh, GDP from 2000, I mean GDP from like 1950, and comparing it to GDP now, then those dollar values are not going to be comparable because there's been quite a bit of inflation. So you got to put them in the same base year. All right, so you got to put them in either 1950 prices, 2021 prices, or you can pick like 2009 prices. You got to put them in the same base year, and then you can make comparisons once you take out the effect of inflation. Okay, so nominal GDP is just that year's specific price. Real GDP controls for inflation, all right, reflects changes in price, which is inflation, and puts everything in a base year. So it doesn't matter what base year you choose. It does matter that you put them all in the same base year. So if you're comparing GDP over multiple years, you want to put them all in terms of pick a base year, 2009, 2021. um, I kind of like to put things in more current years because it makes more sense. Like you can do the same comparison, put everything in like $1,900 from 100 years ago, but that wouldn't. I mean, you can the interpretations are fine. It just makes I think it makes more uh, intuitive sense if you put them in more recent terms. Okay, so this we'll do an example like this or similar to this in the homework, but this is the idea. So here we have let's assume that GDP is just measured by output, and the only output in this simple example is pizza. Okay, so what you want to do to compare GDP across the different years is you want to pick a base year and put all the prices for different years in that base year. So here we picked the base year of year one. So the base year you pick is the nominal GDP is going to be the same as the real because you're putting it in that terms, or in that year's prices. Okay, so if in year one, output was 5 pizzas, those are $10 each, and this is the base year. Okay, so the nominal GDP is just 5 times 10, right? 5 pizzas at $10, so $50, and we're putting them in this year's terms, so the real GDP is also going to be $50. Now, to compare the other years, if the price changes, like it does, if the price goes up to 20 for a pizza in year two, okay, you want to put year two's prices in year one's prices. So to do that, you got to make a little price index and kind of deflate the price by dividing it by the price index, or I'll show you how to do this later. But the point is that you're gonna make an index and use that index to, in this case, deflate the price. So 7 times 20 in year two is 140. But if we put that in terms of year one prices, it's only 70. So GDP has gone up, but not by as much as the dramatic increase because you controlled for inflation. Okay, and you would do the same for all the other years. You'd put this year's, you make an index for this year, all right, get the nominal GDP and then put it into uh, that year's prices. So nominal GDP is easy. You just multiply the price times the quantity. To get real GDP, pick a year. Here we picked year one. All right, get an index that essentially deflates that to that year and put all the other prices in terms of that. So you can see that the price is going up in real terms, but not nearly as much as it would if you didn't control for inflation. Okay. And so if you're, um, so you normally have inflation over the years. So if you're putting prices, if you're putting GDP in terms of a previous year, you're normally deflating it because you're deflating the price. If you're putting prices in terms of a more current year, right, you're inflating the price. And so that's kind of that's what we're doing here. So here, because the first year was the base year, and that was the lowest price, we're deflating these prices to control for inflation, to put all the other values in terms of year one prices, so we can make more comparisons. So we can see that GDP is going up in real terms, but not as much as if we didn't control for inflation. So you got to control for inflation before you make any claims about GDP. Okay, so we'll do a little couple examples of that, but essentially, real GDP is just GDP adjusted for inflation. Okay. Now, economic growth would look at how GDP, or real GDP or real GDP per capita, which we'll discuss, changes over time. And slide 12 will talk about economic growth. Okay, so economic growth in this terms, if we're looking at GDP, is just increase in real GDP or real GDP per capita over some period of time. It's the percent change or the percent rate of growth. Um, okay, and if that change is negative, right? If you have a negative, if your GDP drops from one period to the next, then this would be a negative percent, and you have a rate of decrease. So normally you have economic growth, and I'll try to show you the historical data for GDP in the U.S. so we can look at that in a minute. But when you're trying to look at what the growth rate is or what the economic growth is, you're just looking at the percent change from one period to the next. And you can look at that in terms of real GDP, which we talked about, just controlled for inflation. Or another nice thing is to control for population. So if you control for population, you're putting it in real GDP per capita terms. All right, and so not only are we controlling for inflation, we're also controlling for the fact that there's usually more people in the U.S. Over time. There's a population growth rate, and so you often want to control for that because if there's more GDP, higher value, you want to make sure that it's getting distributed amongst the people, because if if GDP is going up but GDP per capita is going down, that's not really economic growth, because on average each person is dividing out to get less. So it's nice to control for population, because uh, that shows, like, per person how much GDP actually is. Where's the right? Okay, so it's a pretty simple concept, but um, so GDP per capita is just or I guess real GDP per capita in this case is just real GDP divided by the population. So if this is 1950, this is real GDP in 2009 dollars. Okay, so it's real GDP because we put all the years in base year 2009. So all of these years' prices are in 2009 dollars, and this were the population in millions. What you do, well, you'd want to make sure that uh, both these terms are in millions or billions before you divide them. But if you divide 200 184 billion by 154 million, then that comes out to this. All right, so GDP per capita is just real GDP divided by population. So on average, in 1950, each person's share of GDP was about 15,000. You can see that that's increased over time, and I'll show you. I'll show you what it is now, but it's somewhere around the 50,000 mark. So GDP per person now is something like 50,000 or 60,000. Okay, so simple concept, just divide GDP by the population, and that shows GDP per person. Okay, another way to measure GDP is by how productive the labor force is. So this is a simple concept, but it's also, pretty informative, because it essentially shows that if you want to add to GDP, there's two main categories you can do that. If you want to produce more stuff and have a higher value of your productivity, two things you can do. You can either work more hours. If the economy works more hours, they're going to produce more. Or they can be more productive. They can produce more stuff, more dollar value per hour. So to lead to growth to increase your growth rate, or to lead to economic growth, uh, the economy can either work more hours, be more productive, or some combination of both. Okay, so this is our simple equation here, where real GDP can be estimated by hours of work, all right, for the whole economy, times labor productivity, which is essentially the dollar value of uh, stuff they produce. So here's the first thing. You can increase the size of the labor force. You can have the average hours of work go up, but if you work more hours, the economy is going to be more productive, right? That's just a fact. Or you can have some, technological advance, right? There was like a dot-com boom. There's uh, many different tech booms which just increase the productivity, right? So, or you can have a better capital. You can increase human capital, which is more education and training. Um, you can be more efficient. So anything that makes average output per hour, like dollar value, go up, be more productive, that also increases GDP. So it's pretty simple, but you can see that these two components comprise some a bunch of different things, like education and technology. But if you'll see that, if holding everything else constant, if the economy works more, they're going to produce more stuff. GDP is going to go up, or if they're more productive, GDP is going to go up as well. So either these two factors, increasing them is going to increase real GDP, or you can do both, right? Okay, let me before I forget, let me show you some data on GDP. and then we can kind of get a eye of what it looks like. So let me see if I can find, or I know I can find, but let me show you some data um, on real GDP and real GDP per capita, and we can see how that's trended recently. Okay, so a nice open source public data set by the Federal Reserve in the US. If you just usually if you just Google Fred data, or I think I have a link in one of the study guides, but you'll find it. The Federal Reserve Economic Data Set, acronym FRED. So FRED data. There's all kinds of free data here, and so the nice thing, one of the nice things about macroeconomic data and looking at macroeconomics is most of the data is free because you're looking at it's public sector, it's open source data. Uh, a lot of the microeconomic data is not free because it's private sector owned and you got to pay for it. So most of these big macro variables and things you can look at the macro level are available here and you can just search for them. So if you go to this data set, the FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data Set, all right, this is probably the most widely used macro data set in the United States. Let me just search for GDP. Okay, it's going to give you a bunch of stuff, um, but usually usually the one you want or the one you're probably going to want to look at so it usually sorts by relevance by default. So the most popular is first. So let me click on this one, real gross domestic product. Okay, so see, this is real GDP in 2000. So see how it tells you that it's billions of chain 2012 dollars. So this is billions, dollar value in billions, and everything is in 2012 dollars. So all of these, every single thing here has been converted to 2012 dollars. So it's all on the same scale. Okay, so everything is measured in 2012 dollars, which is why it's a real gross domestic product. Now you can see that GDP's increased over time. Um, the little gray areas are official recessions, where the economy, we'll talk about recessions, but when the economy was declining or economic growth was negative um, for 6 months, I believe, or more, that's an official recession. And so you can see that even though, so uh, just looking at this, you can see that what happened recently is the most surprising thing probably in this whole 70-year span. So here's GDP growing over time. There's some recessions, and really the two worst drops are the one that happened after the financial crisis in 2008, where GDP dropped for like 2 years, and what happened last March, where GDP just fell off a cliff, but it rebounded so quickly that it's not officially recorded as a recession. What just happened because a recession would mean that the the economy or the country is drop is GDP is falling for 6 months or more. That didn't happen. It fell by a ton in a few months and then it started growing again. So once it starts growing, no more recession. But look at what happened here. So here's quarter one of 2020. There's quarter two, and so that was not a good transition, as we're probably familiar with. Um, this was March April last year where everything shut down. If everything shuts down, nothing's going to be produced, and the value of goods and services went way down. But the economy has, at least in GDP terms, rebounded very quickly. Um, so you can see that it dropped and grew, and it's close to where it was before, not quite, but yeah. And so this is the kind of the this shows economic growth over time in the U.S. and looking at GDP from 1947 all the way to quarter four of last year. We haven't got the data yet for this year's quarter. So probably be up in a few months or so. Yeah, right. The crash of 2008 was hard. So uh, before this happened, the whole lecture was that this is the worst thing we've ever seen. Um, Longest decline, worst hit to the economy, and that's still the case in terms of length. But in terms of what happened during a specific quarter-to-quarter drop, what happened last March has never been seen, as you can see, but it didn't sustain the level of decline that we saw during the financial crisis. So the drop was bigger, but the growth out of the drop was much swifter. Okay, but we'll talk about many different things. Some sectors have rebounded quicker or not been affected at all, where some services or some areas, such as the service industry, is very severely affected and has not yet recovered anytime soon. So these gray areas, this is again, this is officially what happened: real GDP, economic growth over time. These gray areas are recessions. There's your financial crisis, um, and here's what happened just about a year ago. GDP went from that to that, so two, lost about what 2 billion in about a quarter. So pretty surprising, or pretty drastic. Now let me also show you. Okay, you can search for real GDP per capita, so per person. This first one is probably the one we want to look at. So again, this is in 2012 dollars, and this is how much on average, or this is just GDP divided by population. So on average, this is how much each person share of GDP is. So it's gone up quite a bit over time. Uh, right now, we're somewhere a little less than 60,000, and so just look at the like per capita. We were at about 58 in quarter four of 2019, and by quarter two of 2020, all right, so each person on average lost like $6,000 per year in the span of like a few months. So that's it's sometimes it's easier to look at from the per capita terms because you can really see the drop there from all that. Yeah. So this is stating how much the average person make. No, this is just GDP per capita, which means that all we're doing here is we're taking GDP and dividing it by person. And so this is each person's share of GDP on average. So it has nothing to do with how much people make. It's just if this is how much was produced in the economy that year, uh, if everything was divided equally, 100%, everyone got a 100% equal share, that's how much each person would have. Yeah. Okay. So you can see that your GDP per capita has increased over time, dropped during the recessions, and specifically bad the financial crisis years, and just crazy drop in those few months during last March. It has rebounded quite a bit, but this drop is, look at anywhere else on the historical data here, you won't see this drop from that to that in such a short period of time. Yeah, so hopefully we don't see that again because that wasn't good. All right, we'll come back to this data thing. Okay, those are the key concept. So most of this chapter was just talking about GDP, what it is, how we measure it, how to convert or how to calculate real GDP, how to calculate GDP per capita, and how we show economic growth. All right, and then yeah, so there's some optional videos here. Macroeconomics. This is a nice Khan Academy one of accounting for components of GDP. And these two are pretty nice, so you can look at those. Okay, let's look at some examples. Okay, number one. So this is nice because it just I think the hardest thing of measuring GDP is just to know if something's counted and where it goes. Um, so it's usually pretty clear, but sometimes it's a little confusing, especially like the housing thing, new homes. Like when someone buys a used home, it doesn't count. But when someone buys a new home, it goes into gross domestic investment, stuff like that. So the housing one is a little tricky, but everything else is pretty more self-explanatory. Number one. So which of the following are included in this year's GDP? So the services of a commercial painter in painting the family home. Now, this is not included because this is just like um, this is a painter who just does a side job and paints the family home. So there's no transaction going on. No one's spending. He's just doing it kind of, he's a professional. He's doing it as like it's like a hobby. So there's no one buys it. He just does it. So that's not included because there's no spending record of that happening. B, an auto dealer's sale of a new car to a non-business customer. So the only thing you see is sale of a new car. All right, that gets counted. That's a new thing. That goes into the uh, the consumption category. C, the money received by Smith when she sells her biology textbook to a used book buyer. All right, so you see anything where it says used book, that's not included because that was included in whatever year that book was published first. So if it was published in, if the new book was published in 2010, it went in that year's GDP, doesn't go in this one's. But the publication and sale of a new economics textbook, if that's a brand new textbook, that's a new good, that gets included. And that goes into whatever category buys it, whether it's government spending or consumption spending. Whoever buys that new textbook, they pay for that. That goes into that category. Uh, a 2 billion increase in business inventories. Okay, so this one also a little tricky, but this would go into the IG category, the gross private domestic investment, because this is a change in the value of what the business has. So if the business adds to its inventory and doesn't sell it, that still counts because new stuff was produced and there's a value on that. So if any private firm or business adds to their inventory, like produces new cars or new computers but doesn't sell them, that still gets counted because that's like an increase in their capital. Okay, so this would increase the IG category. And then F, government purchases of newly, I don't know if I worded that, government buys a new aircraft. So government purchases of newly produced aircraft. So that's a new aircraft that would go into the G category because the government is buying a new aircraft. Okay, so what we see here is that any stuff that's uh, off the record, not counted, new goods or services get counted, used things don't. And the only weird one here, I think, is the business inventory thing, where if there's a just if the inventory of the company goes down, that's a drop in their uh, gross private investment. Okay, so I think the most tricky one is the IG category because that includes the homes, that includes changes in inventories because you gotta see what the value of those goods and services are. Uh, that firm or that private company has produced during that year. Okay, number 2. Let's use the following, whatever that acronym data is, compute GDP. Okay, so we got a bunch of categories, and we're going to use our equation that we talked about. So GDP, start with this. GDP equals C plus IG plus G plus XN. So that's your equation. And again, XN is exports minus imports. So just put it in the categories and put it all together. So GDP equals consumption. C is personal consumption expenditure, so that's 245, plus IG, which is gross private domestic investment, that's 86, put that there, plus G, which is government purchases, 82, that goes there, and then plus exports minus imports. So plus exports, which are 9, but then minus imports, which is 18. So this part is going to be negative because, which the US often does, um, imports are bigger than exports. So the imports go into whatever that country produced them into their GDP. Exports count for our GDP. So this would come out to 245 plus 86 plus 82 minus 9. So we'd get a nice estimate here of GDP because these are in billions. Okay, that plus that plus that minus that is 404 billion. Okay, so all we're doing here is starting with our equation, this one, and put in the categories and the things that you don't put in the things that, um, yeah. Okay, number 3. So this one does the converting to from nominal to real GDP. So suppose that in 1984, the total output in a single good economy was 7,000 buckets of chicken, and in 1984 each bucket was priced at $10. Then in 2004 the price per bucket of chicken was 16, and there were 22,000 buckets produced. So let's determine real GDP for 84 and 04 in 1984 prices. So it tells you that that's your base year. So we're going to put all the years in, well, there's only 2 years, but we're going to leave this 84 years and 84 prices. And we're going to put $2004 in 84 prices and then compare them once everything is in the 1984 price scale. So the way to do that is I make a little chart here. So, I mean, the because there's only one good, you can technically I want to show you how the index works. That's the point here. Now, the easiest thing to do would be just multiply uh, the number of buckets produced in 2004 times the price in 2008 in 1984, right? So if you just put everything in $10 prices, that's the easiest thing. But what's important here is that if you have multiple goods or multiple items, you want to make an index, and this shows how the index is determined. So the full version is you put the years. So we got the 2 years here, 84 and 2004. Okay, it told us that the quantity produced in each year, which was 7,000 buckets in 84 and 22,000 in 2004. Okay, it tells us the price of a bucket of chicken was $10 in 84 and $16 in 04. Okay, so this stuff was all given. Now what we need to do is develop an index, calculate nominal GDP, and then calculate real GDP. So there's only one thing to calculate here because there's 2 years and one of them is already in the base year, but okay. So what I like to do is make an index for this type of problem, and the index is determined by just dividing uh, whatever year you're in, divide that price, that nominal price, by the base year price. And that way whatever the base year is, that index is going to be 1 for that year because the nominal is going to be the same as the real because you're using that year's prices. So divide all of the nominal prices by the base year price. But for the base year that's being used, it's going to be 1. So here's the $10 price in 84. Divide that by the base year price, which is 10. So 10 divided by 10 gives us an index of 1 for 1984. Now, for 2004, to get that index, always divide the nominal price, 16, by the base year price, which is 10. So 16 divided by 10 gives us an index for 2004 of 1.6. And we're going to use this index to put uh, GDP in 2004 into 1984 prices, right? Okay, next column is just nominal GDP, so that's just in the current, or in the nominal year. Just multiply the number of stuff produced, or the number produced by the price. So 7,000 times 10, 70,000. And for this one, 22,000 times 16 is 352,000. So this is the nominal GDP for 84 and the nominal GDP for 2004, which is just the number produced times the price of that good in that year. Now, the important thing is converting the nominal to real. So last category is real GDP, and it said we want to put them in 1984 prices. So to be thorough, uh, divide the nominal GDP by the index. And you can see that for 84, 70,000 divided by 1 is going to give us 70,000 because the base year is that year. So if you do it correctly, or like the way I did it, then when you convert real GDP for the base year, it should come out to the same as the nominal year because you're using the same prices. So 70,000 divided by 1 is 70,000. So the nominal GDP for 1984 is 70,000, and the real GDP for 1984 is also 70,000 because it's in 84 prices. But there was inflation, so that means we're going to deflate the 2004 nominal GDP into 84 prices, and that's easy. Just divide the nominal GDP by the index you got for that year. So 352,000, the nominal GDP, divided by that year's index, 1.6, will give us a real GDP of 220,000. So this is the real GDP for 2004 in 1984 prices. So see how it's much less? And GDP went up by quite a bit, but not nearly as this dramatic jump because we adjusted or controlled for this inflation. Okay, okay. So nice simple example, but this is a nice way of, so you just want to kind of set up these categories, um, determine an index by dividing the current year's price by the base year price, and then get nominal GDP by just by multiplying price times quantity for that year. And real GDP is always nominal GDP divided by that year's index. The question is, on the index for 16 divided by 10, yeah, so um, the way I get the index is divide the current year's prices, the nominal year's prices, by the base year price. So the nominal year's prices in 2004 is 16, and we chose 84 as the base year price, so the base year price is 10. So if there are more years, divide them all by 10 to get that index. So let me see if I can write that. Uh, Okay, so to get the index, divide the nominal year price by the base year price. So the nominal year, so in 2004, okay, yeah, so that's how we did it. So if there were more years, like we'll have in some other examples, divide all the nominal prices. Like if we had, let's say, we had 2005. Okay, and let's say the price of a bucket of chicken in 2005 was $20. Okay, and then to get the index for 2005, right, exactly, yeah. So 20 divided by 10, so it would be 2. Yeah, okay, exactly. So yeah, so all you gotta do is whenever it'll tell you what the base year is, and then divide all the other prices by that base year price, and that number one, that should give you your index of 1 in the base year, and all the other indexes will be used by just dividing their price by the base year price. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, any other questions on this one? Or we see what how to do the index? It's a little tricky, but it's a nice way of seeing how you convert something from nominal to real just by developing an index based on the kind of the ratio of the prices. So, oh no, because it says here. So determine real GDP for 1984 and 2005, 2004 in 1984 prices. So the problem tells you if you do it in this year's prices, that's the base year. So if it says can put everything in this year's prices, that means that 84 is the base year price. So yeah, so it'll tell you what year to put it in. Or I mean, yeah, right. So it didn't. I guess it didn't say base, but if it says in this year's prices, then that's the base year. Yeah. Okay. So this is a simple example, but that's essentially what happens is you like for all that GDP data we looked at, they develop an index for all those years, or probably just a formula, but the index is converted based on whatever the year was. So okay, so remember I showed you this, and what they did here is the base year is 2012. So every index that wasn't 2012, right? 2012 the index was 1. All the other years you divide those years nominal GDP by the 2012 GDP price, and then everything is converted to 2012. So that's what you do, or that's what they did, is they made an index by choosing 2012 as the base year and making an index that converts all the previous years, like kind of inflates them, and all the newer years deflates them based on everything is in an index for base year 2012. So that's all we did there. Okay. Number 4, let's suppose an economy's real GDP is 30,000 in year 1 and 31,000 in year 2. What is the growth rate of its real GDP? And also assume that population is 100 in year 1 and 102 in year 2. Then what is the growth rate of real GDP per capita? So there's two things. So first, to get the growth rate, just get the percent change. All right, so the percent change is just the change over the original. So a real GDP growth rate is the newer value, year 2, 31,200, minus the original value, 30,000 in year 1, divided by the original. So the change, in this case, the increase, the difference over the original, gives us, in decimal terms, 0.04, multiplied by 100 to get percent, and you get 4%. So going from 30,000 to 31,000 in a 1 year span is an increase of 4%. So again, just kind of similar to what we did with the elasticity, just take the new value minus the old value divided by the old value. Okay, so the change over the original. Then the question asked, for what is the growth rate of GDP per capita? So to get that, you first want to get GDP per capita. All right, so GDP per capita in year 1 is year 1's GDP divided by the population. So year 1's GDP was 30,000. It gives that the population in year 1 is 100. So 30,000 divided by 100 is GDP per capita, which is 300. And for year 2, same thing, GDP per capita in year 2 is that year's GDP, 31,200, divided by that year's population, 102. So 31,200 divided by 102 is approximately 306. Okay, so therefore the GDP per capita growth rate is, when we go from 300 to 306, what's the percent increase? So 306 minus 300 divided by 300, the change over the original, the new value, minus the old value divided by the old value, gives us 0.02. And in percent terms, just multiply that by 100 and you get 2%. So you can see here that the growth rate in GDP per capita is lower because it controls for population growth. So once we take out the fact that there was more people, that 4% is only 2% because on average, each person's share of GDP only went up by 2%, not 4%. So see how if your population goes up and you do GDP per capita, then your growth rate of GDP per capita is always going to be less because you had to cancel out the effect of more people, the population growth. So real GDP controls for inflation, GDP per capita controls for population, and this would kind of show that effect there. Okay, so we're good on this one. I think there's one like this in the homework where you're going to do a little growth rate for GDP, and then GDP per capita, and then the growth rate of GDP per capita. So yeah, okay. Last one, number 5. Suppose that work hours in New Zombie are 200 in year 1 and productivity is $8 per hour. So this is using the hours of work and labor productivity thing. So 200 hours were worked, and on average they're producing $8 of stuff per hour. So this is the productivity. This is the work hours. Okay, what is New Zombie's real GDP? So remember, we had that simple equation where real GDP was just hours of work times labor productivity. This goes up, or this goes up, or both go up, we produce more GDP. So you can get a nice measure of GDP by just putting in the hours of work in year one, which is 200, and multiply that by their productivity, which is $8 of output per hour. So 200 hours times $8 per hour. If you multiply those together, the hours cancel out, and that's 200 times 8, which is a GDP estimated of 1600. Okay, so just use that simple equation and plug in hours of work and labor productivity. And then second part is if work hours increase to 210 in year two and productivity increases to $10 per hour, what is New Zombie's rate of economic growth? So first we got to calculate real GDP based on this equation in year two, and then see what the change was. So same thing, real GDP in year two is the hours worked, which were given 210, times labor productivity, which was given at $10 per hour. So 210 hours times $10 per hour, hours cancel out, and that gives us a GDP in year two of 2,100. And the final question was, what's the rate of economic growth? So we went from this 1,600 to 2,100. What's that percent increase? Okay, so same thing. Rate of economic growth is the change over the original, so the new value in year two minus the old value in year one divided by the old value, and this would come out to 0.3125, and in percent terms, it's a very big jump, 31.25%. Okay. Questions on any of these problems or the examples here? All right. Okay. So I think that we'll get to the homework in a minute, but that's it for chapter 10. We have one more chapter to do, um, which is chapter 11. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. Okay. So we can open up. So we can open up the study guide for chapter 11. Okay, and then let's also get the PowerPoint for chapter 11 there. Okay, we'll get to the homework after we do this chapter. Okay, so we talked about the first thing we talked about in macroeconomics, which is GDP, and there's a couple things you're probably familiar with or want to discuss, which are unemployment and inflation. We're going to cover those things in this chapter. So we'll talk a little bit about business cycles and recessions, and then we'll talk a little bit about unemployment and a little bit about inflation. And yeah, so we're covering in chapters 10 and 11 all kind of the big key macro terms. And so that's what we're doing here. So let's go ahead and start. First key concept is business cycles. Let's talk about those on slides 2 through 7. Okay, so a business cycle, by definition, is alternating increases and decreases in economic growth or activity over time. And so there's usually, or we kind of label four different phases or areas of the business cycle. So there's peak, recession, trough, and expansion, and that looks nice here in the next slide. So if you have the idea here is that you have a general increase in economic growth over time, but around that growth trend, there's periods where the economy is doing better and periods where the economy is doing worse. And so there's a cycle around the trend where if you reach a high point, that's a peak. If the economy is declining for a certain period of time, that's a recession. If you reach a low point, that's a trough. And if you're growing for a certain period of time, that's an expansion. So it's not a perfect, circle cycle like this, but if we look at the data, we'll see that the economy fluctuates where it's doing better than the trend, worse than the trend, and this business cycle kind of fluctuates around the trend over time. And so if I were to show you the data again, where'd it go? All right, so here's real gross domestic product again. All right, so you can see that the trend that we kind of simplified in that graph is just this. If you drew a straight line or just kind of estimated this general increase over time, that's your growth trend. So clearly, if you just step back and look, the GDP, real GDP has increased over time at a pretty, clear rate. All right. So, but if you zoom in, let's see if we can look at what's happened recently. So let's try this. Oh, that didn't do it. That didn't do anything. All right. Well, I'm trying to zoom in, to kind of show you how it fluctuates, but you can see like if I drew a straight line from this point to this point, that would be the trend. But you can see that sometimes, like here, the economy is doing better than the trend, and sometimes when we get in a recession, we dip down and we're below the trend. So, and then obviously here, this is below the trend, and this is getting back to the trend. So when the economy is increasing for a certain period of time over the trend, that's an expansion. And like here, when the economy is decreasing for a certain period of time below the trend, that's a recession. So the economy kind of if you step back and look at the general rate of growth, you see it, but there's certain periods of time where the economy does poorly or better than the trend, and that's what we call the business cycle here. Oops. Okay, so let's mention the recessions, the official recessions, and then also the impact of durables versus non-durables that you normally see in a recession, which in this current state is not really the standard effect. But okay, so what this little or what this chart shows you is the official recessions since 1950. So there was, and this is the period of the recession, the number of months. It's got to be at least 6 months to be an official recession. And this is the average decline in real output. And you can see that the worst one on this list is the 2007 2009 that lasted. We GDP declined for 18 months and at a little more than 4%. So that was the worst one. that was the longest one and the worst one. Now again, um, the drop in like a year ago in last March and last April isn't. I mean, it's technically it wasn't a recession because to be a recession it has to last for 6 months, and it didn't last for 6 months. It dropped really fast and started growing again. So because we didn't have declines in output for 6 consecutive months, it was only like 2 months or some 3 months. Okay, not officially a recession. Doesn't mean it wasn't bad, but that's why we're not putting it on this list because the economy didn't decline for 6 consecutive months. It declined super fast and started growing again a few months later. So kind of the 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 catch is that the economy dropped so quickly that uh, there was nowhere to go but up after a few months, right? Um, okay, so what causes the business cycle? All right, and so there's a demand shock or a supply shock, meaning that something happens to demand or something happens to supply that wasn't expected. Like there's an increase in demand for a certain good. Like there's probably a demand shock right now for lumber. Like there's the demand for lumber to do home improvements or build houses is super high. A supply shock is when something changes the supply chain. Like um, during the pandemic, there were certain things that couldn't be obtained. Like um, for a while, we couldn't get enough stuff to make masks, things like that. So like medical supplies weren't available. So that was a supply shock. Right. So things that like this that happen unexpectedly can cause the business cycle to go up or down. Um, we'll talk more about this concept later, but it's very important that usually prices don't adjust quickly downward, which is why we often lead to recessions because we're the prices of the economy don't really adjust based on what's happening, and so because of that, um, it's often hard to get out of the recession because prices don't adjust. Just we stop producing things, people get unemployed, but the prices of goods and services don't necessarily drop during a recession because prices don't adjust quickly. It's very rare that prices in stores or price or wages will drop during a recession. Most likely, what happens is uh, people get laid off or less stuff gets produced, but the general price level. I'll show you inflation data in a minute. The general price level doesn't drop very often. Okay, what causes the shocks? So any of these things can cause a shock or different things, but innovation. So if there's some tech boom that can cause a um, expansion, increases or decreases in productivity. If there's a monetary factor, like usually this is not a big thing in the U.S. because the financial sector, um, the central bank is pretty stable, but some countries there's things that go on with their exchange rates or monetary factors which could lead to recessions. Big political events like upheavals or things like that can cause recessions. Financial instability, which is can happen in other countries, not so much in the U.S., but and the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009 that clearly caused a recession. Okay, we're gonna talk about this more in chapter 14 or chapter 15 or something. Okay, so this slide is a little contradictory to what's happened recently because, well, normally when the economy is doing poorly, the goods that are affected the most are capital goods and consumer durables. Now, consumer durables, well, So durables are things that last 3 years or more, which would be like automobiles and houses. Um, so this is kind of not what we've seen recently. So the economy didn't do very well here. Uh, do that. Actually, let me zoom into. There we go. All right, that's nice. So here's well, not nice, but okay. So here's 2019. Here's that drop uh, last March or last April. So the economy kind of declined for a little bit, not officially a recession, and then kind of rebounded. But we didn't really see what we'd normally expect during a recession or a downturn, where consumers stop buying capital goods and durables. So even during the recession and during the last year, the demand for cars and the demand for houses has not gone down. It's in fact gone up. And normally, what we see in a recession is that this the goods that are affected, or the sector that's affected the least, is services and food, and that's been affected the most. So we've kind of had even though this is not an official recession the last year, we've had a big downturn, somewhat of a recovery, but in that downturn, the the things we expect to go down in the downturn, where people stop buying houses and cars, didn't happen. That went up, and the services industry that usually stays okay during a recession, because people still during a recession people still get haircuts or go to bars or go to restaurants. That didn't happen because that was the sector that was cut off during the pandemic. So normally what we see didn't happen at all. In fact, it was the opposite. So we kind of have a very rare situation, which is contradictory to what we've seen in other recessions, where normally during a recession people don't buy houses and don't buy cars, but they still go to bars and restaurants. Here, complete opposite. The economy did poorly. People stopped going to restaurants. People stopped going to bars. People stopped getting haircuts, and people bought houses and cars. So it's somewhat contradictory, but that's kind of what happened. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is this slide, this cyclical impact, is normally what happens, but I'm telling you now that this is not what happened in the last year. Okay, let's talk about unemployment. Okay, so in slides 8 to 10, we'll introduce unemployment and talk about the types of unemployment and kind of the economic concept of full employment. Oh, that's not that one. Good. Okay, so here we go. So, okay, so here we go. Unemployment. So you probably know what the unemployment rate is. Let's briefly discuss how it's measured and its strengths and weaknesses. So this little graph here, don't worry about the numbers, but this shows what goes into the unemployment rate and what doesn't. So basically, this purple category, if you're under 16, you can't legally work, or you're institutionalized, you're in prison, you're not part of the labor force. Um, if you're voluntarily not in the labor force, like you're retired, you're a stay-at-home parent, you're in college, you choose not to work, you're not in the labor force. So the labor force is only, by this definition, um, people who are working or people who are looking for work but cannot find it. So you're only considered unemployed if you're actively looking for work and cannot find it. So take the people who are too young or in prison out. Uh, Anyone who voluntarily is retired, not working, going to school, just choosing to stay at home, they're not part of this statistic. It's only the people who uh, are trying to be employed who cannot be. So here's how the unemployment rate is calculated. It's essentially the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So it's the percent of people that want to find work that cannot find it. So it only concerns the specific population that is either working or looking for work. And again, or not again, but to be considered employed, um, all you have to be doing is working at 1 hour per week. And so if you're working at least an hour per week, you're employed. All right. So that might not be your best situation. You might be looking for more work, but if you're working uh, at least an hour per week, you're considered employed. The only people who are unemployed are the people who are actively looking for work and cannot find any work. So it's kind of a skewed statistic, as you're probably familiar with, but that's kind of how it's calculated. So it's the number of people who cannot find work at all as a percentage of the people who are working at least 1 hour per week. And again, the purple section and the yellow section are taken, or the orange section are taken out. Okay? So that's how it's measured when you see the unemployment rate. And you can probably guess that it's not perfect because there's probably lots of people who would like to work more, like lots of people who don't like the job they're working at, which would like a different job. But in this metric, as long as you're working at least an hour per week, you're employed, and you're only counted as unemployed if you're actively looking for work and pursuing it. And if you stop looking for work, you're not part of the unemployment. Okay, so unemployment rate you're probably familiar with, which you're probably not familiar with unless you looked ahead or read the chapter, are the categories of unemployment. So there's essentially three categories, and these are those. So first category of unemployment, or first type of unemployment, is frictional. And so this is essentially when individuals are searching for jobs or waiting for jobs to take jobs soon. So this is when, like if you just graduate college and you're kind of doing interviews and searching for a job, that's this type. If you're relocating, like you're moving to a new, you're in the same company, the same industry, and you're relocating to a different location, that might take some time. That's frictional. So if it takes some time for you to get uh, to transition or get to a new location or go from college or just get from one job to the next, that's frictional. Now, structural unemployment is when changes in the structure of the demand for labor change. So this is happening now because the specific types of jobs in demand by companies and firms are changing. So you've probably seen over the last year that uh, the demand for certain types of jobs has changed a little bit. And if that happens, if the structure of what's available changes, then that's structural unemployment. So when people are transitioning from the fact that the demand for their previous job has changed and they have to transition to a different type of job that's in more demand now, that's structural. Okay, and the worst one is cyclical. And so this is caused by the recessionary phases of the business cycle. All right, so basically, this is when people are transitioning or searching. This is when people have to change jobs because uh, what's available to them has changed. This is just when the economy is doing poorly and there aren't enough jobs available, which is clearly what happened here. Oops. Oh, so let me show you let me search for unemployment. Or yeah. Okay, so here is the unemployment rate, which is monthly, and look at that. So much more volatile. And what you see is these are the same recessions that we saw in the GDP graph, and clearly there's no disputing that if we're in a recession, unemployment goes up. Right? Every time you see the gray, less people can get work. Right? Recession, unemployment goes up. Recession, unemployment goes up. Recession. Look at what happened in here's February, 3.5%. Here's March. There's May. So unemployment went from 3.5% to almost 15% in like a month. Yeah. So that's what happens there. Okay, and so I was showing you that so what was I saying? So the types of unemployment kind of reflect the different changes, but this was just the fact that uh, a lot of jobs couldn't be available. Production was down, demand was down, and there just weren't enough jobs available. So this whole jump would be cyclical because the number of jobs just weren't available for this period of time, and so that jump from 3.5% to 15% in a matter of months was reflecting the fact that there just weren't enough jobs available and production and demand was down. Okay, so now where are we at now? 6% as of last month. Okay, so we've done much better as an economy, but still compared to what happened before pandemic terms, still not nearly there. But look at look at this whole picture of data, and nothing's happened like this ever. All right. What is the economic definition of full employment? So the economists never expect unemployment to be zero. So we always expect people to be there to be some type of frictional. People are always going to be searching or transitioning or graduating college, and the nature of jobs are always going to be changing a little bit. Uh, this is the problem we're trying to avoid, like we did recently, where just there aren't enough jobs available. So usually around 5% is the expectation, or a little bit less. Um, so anything above 5%, or even at 5% is not ideal. And so economists expect unemployment to be around a certain level, between 3 and 5%. But um, when the economy cannot achieve its potential, like it did in last March and April, that's we're we're below full employment because not enough people can get jobs. So there's kind of a target where you expect unemployment to be something like 3 to 5%. Okay. Inflation. Okay. So inflation is something you're probably used to hearing recently. Is there going to be inflation? Is there not? So slides 13 to 14, inflation. All right. So inflation by definition is a general rise in the price level, and by the nature of it, inflation reduces the purchasing power of money because if you have a certain income and the prices go up, it costs you more to buy those things, so it reduces your purchasing power. If you make a certain income and the prices of groceries go up, uh, you can buy less of them, so your purchasing power has gone down. Now, the way inflation is measured is by putting everything in this consumer price index, which I'll show you data for. And the consumer price index is the price of a basket of goods and services that the general public is expected to buy. Uh, what goes into this basket gets changed all the time, depending on what's more popular, things like that. So, but it's supposed to reflect um, the general level of prices for a basket of consumer goods. And so when that general price level of the basket changes, it goes up. That's inflation. When it goes down, it's deflation, or when it stays the same, it's nothing. So let me show you why this is. Let me show you what this looks like, and I'll also show you why it might not. All right. So the whole. So when let me see. So when there's concern now about uh, the lower interest rates causing inflation, which is a concern. The inflation that we're specifically talking about is this growth of the CPI. So if I show you the inflation or the consumer price index by this definition, let me show you what that looks like. Okay, here it is, the consumer price index, and this is okay. So this is the consumer price index, right? In where base year is 82, 84. That's base year 100. Everything else is converted into those years, that base year. And so this shows that there's a general increase in the price level over time. So this increase is inflation. And you can see very rarely, in terms of this metric, do prices go down, where they did pretty noticeably in 2008, 2009, right? Prices actually went down, and they did briefly here, but not nearly as much as probably they should have. So here's the recent trend. Oh, that's good enough there. So here's so pretty much always over time the general there is inflation over time. The general price level increases, and that's expected to be 1.5 or 2%. Rarely do you see prices drop like they did here, even briefly from March 2020 to down, right? So there was deflation right there for a few months. So the price level went down when everybody was, running out of toilet paper and stuff like that. So prices actually went down, but they've since um, increased above their levels that they were before. So that little dip there, but now inflation is back again, or inflation is back to what we normally see there. So the concern is that which we have to wait till the next, or we have to wait till the financial sector stuff to talk about. But I guess the general concern now with low interest rates is that that is going to cause inflation, and the problem is the way inflation is measured, which kind of gets an average of the consumer bundle. It's hard to um, isolate that, but so there's what inflation doesn't include is something that probably the majority of the households spend their income on, which is housing. So, okay, so housing prices are not included in the CPI. So this whole thing, which measures official inflation, does not include housing prices. So the reason that's or well, the reason that's done, I guess, is because houses are considered an investment. It goes into the private investment spending category, and doesn't calculate or doesn't go into the consumer price index. So that's kind of a so when interest rates are super low, which they are now, which we're going to talk about later, but so you can see that interest rates have been low for a while, and there hasn't been a super jump in the CPI. So we don't see crazy rates of inflation. But what I will show you is that okay, so I just searched for prices, and this is the first one, which I looked at earlier. So this is the S&P Popular U.S. National Home Price Index. Okay, I'm going to click on this. Okay, so clearly this is much a little bit different than what we saw in this in the CPI. And again, this is not included in the CPI. But I would pose to argue that this drastic increase in the price of homes might be a little bit caused by low interest rates because if it's cheaper to borrow, the value of that good you're going to pay for is going to go up because more people can borrow, but um, the price of the good they're going to pay for is going to increase because now they can borrow more. So while it might be difficult to point to low interest rates causing increase in that inflation measured by the CPI, this skyrocket here of housing prices in the last years, June, July, August. Okay, that's not officially inflation, but that's an increase in something that households spend about like a third of their income on. So that won't count as inflation, but that is I think a direct cause of low interest rates. Okay, where are we at? Okay, so this is how you so this is officially how you calculate inflation. You get the CPI. Um, so just like we did with the chicken, you put the CPI in terms of a base year. So here we got base years 84, 82, 84, and this is the CPI in 2013 and 2014. So if the general price level changes, uh, then that's your inflation. So if the CPI goes in real terms from 233 to 236.7, that's inflation of 1.6%. So that's saying the general price level, which is measured by the CPI, and that's about 1.6% to 2% is about standard. So that's how you measure inflation. But again, note that home prices not included in this metric at all. So that's a separate thing. Okay, deflation. If prices go down like they did here, okay, so you can see over time there's a general increase in the price level, but if the price from a specific year goes down, like it did there, that's deflation. That's a little bit of deflation. Now, it doesn't happen very often, but the most notable periods of deflation were specifically in 2008, and then just a little bit for that month when everything shut down. So even though when I went to the grocery store during that time, I didn't see it. It seemed like prices were higher, but I guess the general price level was down. Uh, types. Okay, so when you do your calculation for the CPI, and it turns out that this is the good example of 2008 to 2009. So the CPI in real terms went down from 2015 to 2014. And if you do the calculation there, the change is negative. So that's a negative um, change of negative 0.4%. So if you have a negative percent, a negative change in your price, that's deflation. Okay, types of inflation, slide 17. All right, so the demand pull inflation is the first type. So this is caused by the demand side by consumers. So if there's excess spending relative to output, or the central bank gives too much money, so if consumers just start saying they're willing to pay more, if demand goes up for a certain good or service, that's inflation. Like there's definitely inflation in like the sports card industry has seen an increase in prices, and like the things like that, like digital art has also increased a lot just because people want it more. And so if consumers bid up the price, that's inflation. The other side is cost push, which is due to when the input price for a final good increases, then that's going to lead to inflation there. So if like we're looking at cars or something, and the price or the price of the goods that go into the car, like rubber or the metal or the electronics, if any of that stuff goes up, the suppliers are going to raise the price because it's now more costly to produce it. So two things can cause inflation, or both. Consumers just decide they'll spend more on a certain good, or uh, suppliers have to raise the price because their cost of production has gone up. All right, so we've seen both of these things occur in various settings recently. Okay, so we're getting close to 2 hours here. All right, so let me just we have some examples, and then we're getting close to done. So I did all the key terms. Um, Business cycles, unemployment, inflation. All right, there's the link to the Fred data if you want to look at that. We're not going to load this because it takes a while to load, but there's a little link if you want to see how movies are adjusted for inflation. There are some videos on GDP, business cycles and fiscal policy, unemployment, and inflation. All right, so a bunch of things you can look at if you want. Let's run through some examples, and then let me just make sure that everyone doesn't have any questions on the homework assignment. Number one. So, what are the two primary phases of the business cycle, and what tends to happen to real GDP, unemployment, and inflation during these phases? So remember, the two phases are the economy is declining.
I need to pay mine.
What? Okay, so either the economy is declining, which is a recession, or if the economy is growing, that's an expansion. And it said what happens to those key variables during those periods. So if we're in a recession, like we saw in the data, GDP goes down, unemployment goes up, but very rarely, unless it's an extreme situation like we saw recently, do prices change. So there usually isn't inflation unless something really rare happens, like a financial crisis or a pandemic. But in an expansion, real GDP goes up, unemployment goes down, and usually prices increase. Okay, how many recessions has the U.S. experienced since 1950, and which ones were the longest and the most severe in terms of declines in real output? So I showed you that chart. There were 10 recessions officially. The worst one on the chart was the financial crisis one, 2007 and 2009, which was the longest and also the worst in terms of average output decline. So based on those 10, the most recent financial crisis was by far the worst. What are the three types of unemployment? And unemployment is seen by some as undesirable. Are all three types of unemployment undesirable? So remember, we had frictional, we had structural, we had cyclical that we talked about. And in terms of the natural rate of unemployment and what economists expect, only the cyclical type is undesirable because that's what happened, in March and April when there just wasn't enough jobs to go around. These other two types, frictional and structural, are considered to be or expected to happen because people always transition, the jobs always change, but if there just aren't enough jobs, that's bad, that's undesirable. Uh, that's what happened a year ago, or that's still kind of what's happening. Okay, number four, distinguish between um, demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So remember, demand pull is on the demand side when excess spending relative to output, or the bank gives up too much money, or this is just when a certain when consumers decide they're going to pay, they'll pay more for goods and services. So if demand for enough things goes up, that's going to lead to inflation. Okay, so again, not technically included in the inflation thing, but clearly the demand for uh, housing has gone up. That's led to an increase in prices because it's been shown that people are willing to spend more. Cost push inflation. Okay, these are supply shocks. If the cost to produce a final good or service goes up, then firms are going to increase their price. So yeah, another, if the cost to produce something goes up, then they're going to have to charge a higher price to cover their cost. So that's on the supply side there. If it gets more costly, price is going to go up. Number 5. Okay, suppose that a country's annual growth rates were these numbers over a 10-year period. And uh, what was the country's trend rate of growth? Where were the recessions and where were the expansions? So the trend, if these are rates, then the trend is just the average, right? So this fluctuates around the trend, and the growth trend would be the average of these rates, which would be all these numbers divided by 10. So on average, the growth trend was 2.7%. But if the economy is growing, like it was in these years, 1, 2, and 3, that's an expansion. If the economy is declining, like it was in years 4 and 5, that's a recession. And if the economy is growing, so even if the growth rate goes down, it's still growing. And so anytime you see a positive growth rate, the economy is growing. If you see a negative growth rate, the economy is declining. Okay, last one. If the CPI was 110 last year and is 121 this year, what is this year's rate of inflation? Okay, so just take the CPI and get the change. So if it goes from this to this, take the change over the original, 121 minus 110 over 110, and the economy grew at 0.1, which is 10%. In contrast, suppose the CPI was 110 last year and 108 this year, so the price level fell from 110 to 108. What is this year's rate of inflation, and what term do economists use to describe the second outcome? So if the general price level dropped from 110 to 108, do the same calculation, but your new number is lower. So it went from 110 to 108. So it goes 108 minus 110 over 110. So the change is negative, which would give you negative 0.018, and in decimal terms, negative 1.8%. All right. If the price level is increasing, inflation, but if the price level has decreased or is declining, that is deflation. Okay, let me just pull up the homework assignment, then we'll be done. So, okay, homework, chapter 10 and 11. All right, so there's a bunch of questions, but they're pretty short. There's 6 questions, similar to what we did. And number 1 is the only one where, so use that equation we talked about, the GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X. Okay, and go through the little problem and just sum it up. So you're just put the categories into the appropriate thing, and the total GDP is the sum of all the categories. And right here, part B says, uh, what percent of GDP does the value of illegal drugs produced in the economy represent? So that measure is 5 billion. So when you calculate GDP, just calculate this value, 5 billion, as if it were to be a part of, so what, as a relation to GDP that you get from part A, what is 5 billion? So 5 billion as a percent of GDP from part A is the answer here. So just 5 billion divided by whatever this is in percent terms. In part C, by what percentage would GDP be boosted if the value of the services of undocumented workers were included in GDP? I gave that measure here. All right, and so basically, if the GDP goes up 5 billion, what's the percent increase? All right, so these ones little bit different wording than the examples, but you'll get the idea. All right, so get this with the equation. See what percent of illegal drugs represents in relation to that, and then increase GDP by 5 billion, and what's the percent increase? Okay. Number two, you're just doing economic growth, where you're going to calculate growth rate of real GDP, calculate GDP per capita, and then calculate the change in GDP per capita. And notice here that this is a decline from 30 billion to 25 billion. And I put all the numbers in billions. So when you see this 0.008 billion, leave it like that, because when you do GDP per capita, the billions cancel out. So don't freak out when you see 0.008 billion. Just leave it in that. I did it like that to make the math easy. Just leave it like that, and it'll work out nicely. Okay, number three, draw a business cycle, label the phases. Part B is what types of goods are most affected, and part C is what types of goods are somewhat insulated. This is from the slide that I showed you that normally is the case, but recently has been kind of contradictory. So you can either just put what the slide says, or you can say, like, this is what normally happens, but over the last year we have not seen this occur, right? Because houses and capital goods have increased demand, and services have fallen, which is normally what we don't see. Number four, just put in the three types of unemployment, and how do we define full employment in terms of the three types, and what's kind of the target. Number five, what are the two types of inflation? All right, we talked about those, and describe each of those in a couple sentences. And then the last one, number six, is just here's a CPI from one year to the next, do the change for inflation, and then you get a drop from this year to this. You're going to get deflation, and yeah, okay. So okay, there's the homework assignment. There's 6 questions, but they're pretty short, and that covers chapter 10 and chapter 11. Okay, so any questions on what I want you to do here for this one? Okay, so it's 9 o'clock. So sorry I went a little bit over, but all right, so we're just about done. So make sure you get your um, midterms submitted via email tonight if you haven't done that. And the extra credits optional. This is due next Monday, and then next Monday we'll start talking more about fiscal policy and some more macro stuff. So that's it for tonight. Sorry I went a few minutes over, and thank you all for staying and joining. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next Monday.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Professor.